Good afternoon. My name is Bill Purcell, and I am the director of the Institute of Politics here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum here this afternoon. Since 1966, the mission of this institute and of this space has been to unite and engage students with academics and politicians, activists and policymakers, and tonight, once again, that will happen in a very special and real way. And obviously, from the reception you all just provided, this is a group of people that know exactly why they are here. It's my special pleasure to introduce the person who is responsible for our guest being here this afternoon. She has her bachelor's degree in American Studies from Georgetown and went on to get her JD from Georgetown. She followed that immediately with a work clerking for the D.C. Court of Appeals. She became counsel to the Democratic National Committee under both Paul Kirk and also Chairman Ron Brown. She went on to be general counsel to the 1992 Democratic National Convention. She was later chief counsel in the White House Presidential Personnel Office, finance director for the Gore 2000 campaign. She led the transition team at the Democratic National Committee in the year 2005, a critical point in the history of the party and of that committee for reasons that will be clear this evening. She is now the Assistant to the President for Public Policy at the American Federation of Teachers. She directs AFT's legislative, political, field and mobilization, human rights, and community outreach departments. Most importantly, she is currently a resident fellow here at the Institute of Politics. It is my pleasure to present to you Tina Flournoy.
Well, I'm going to start by saying that I am terrified of public speaking, so forgive me if I lose my mind at any point. And it is I've written down notes so I don't forget what I want to say, but it's the fact that I'm even up here introducing someone is a real measure of the great affection that I have for Governor Dean, because ordinarily I would be hiding in the back of the room. I probably shouldn't say this, but it's something that I tell the students who come to my study group and my liaisons that in my life, I never had a great plan for what I would do. Now, my parents had great plans for me, and those included that I be a good Catholic, that I get a good education, and that I stay a Democrat. And they would be pleased to know that I think I've accomplished all three. But it's really the last one, staying a good Democrat, that has led to some of the greatest experiences that I've had in my life, one of which is meeting and working with Governor Dean. And actually, I think that I was the perfect person to work with Governor Dean in 2004. And that is for two reasons. One is I have 4 brothers. So I'm used to constantly saying, hey, stop. Or, as I said to him yesterday, you're not really going to say that, are you? No, you're not. We're not going to have that tomorrow. And the other reason is because I'm from the South. So I would constantly say to the governor, one of the things that really distinguishes us Southerners, we don't feel we have to say out loud every single thing we're thinking. This was a perennial conversation. But the truth of it is that I absolutely adore him, and I will tell you why with this last story. I don't know if you remember this, Governor, but at some point during the campaign last year, early on in the campaign, the two of us had dinner, just the two of us. And, it was one of those dinners I arranged because I thought, I've got to get him in line. I've really got to figure out what is it he's going to do with his life. Where is he going from here? So the entire conversation was, Governor, at some point this election is going to come to an end. Someone is going to be a nominee, and hopefully someone is going to be a Democratic president of the United States. And you need to start thinking about what you want to do. I said, you need to think. Do you want to go into the administration? Do you want to do this? Do you want to be an ambassador? What is it that you want to do? And it didn't take him long to answer me, and that answer has always stuck with me. He said, what I want from a Democratic administration is that we have universal health care in this country. And that was his answer. And having lived in Washington and worked in Washington and worked in politics for a long time, and a private one-on-one dinner like that, there aren't a lot of people who will give you that answer. So it is with great pride and great affection, and I'm honored to introduce Governor Howard Dean.
Well, as you can see, Tina is a hard taskmaster, and I have the scars to prove it. But thank you for your very kind introduction. And there are a lot of stories to be told, and of course I've been told by Tina I'm not allowed to tell any of them, so I won't. But I do want to, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to talk for 20 minutes. I think I may go over a little, but I want to talk about two things. The first is a 50-state strategy, and why it mattered and why it still matters. People ask me all the time, well, if you could talk to Michael Steele, would you have some advice for him? And the truth is, I wouldn't right now. Well, would have some, but I wouldn't want to share that here. But the problem with them is the Republicans are not where we were 4 years ago. The Republicans really have a huge amount of internecine fighting to go through over their ideology before they can get to the fight that we had to have in 2005. We had done all that. We had decided that we were going to be a more centrist party than we had been in the 70s, and more conservative about spending. And Bill Clinton actually led the way to a lot of that kind of thinking. And it made it possible for us to win, but not likely since we had no tools to win with. And so the 50-state strategy came about from my own campaign. The secret of my campaign was not that we were the great internet geniuses. I see Nico sitting over here. He was one of the internet geniuses in the campaign, so I don't want to diss you in any way. But we were not the great inventors of how to run campaigns by the internet. The truth is, you were the inventors of how to run campaigns on the internet, and what we did was have people who were smart enough to figure out what you were doing and then figure out how to centralize it and apply it to the whole country. We had no money when we started. It was a great source of mirth in Washington. We had $160,000 in the bank, and I came from a state of 600,000 people. And what we did have was an incredibly strong message. And the message was not, I hate the war in Iraq, and everybody else was for it. That's what people think the message was. The message was that you matter. The real message of the campaign was you have the power. And it wasn't just a slogan. In fact, that was the message, was that individuals had power that they weren't using. And that power could be used to run the country, and it should be used to run the country. So what happened in the campaign was that there was this thing called Meetup, which some of you have heard of, which was initially started as a service to get people together who had things in common, gardening and whatever. So this loyal person who had been with me for years, who would tell me loved the internet, and she would, once in a while, she'd say, well, Governor, you're number 6 on Meetup. So at first they had to explain what Meetup was, and Governor, you're number 4 on Meetup. Oh, really? Governor, you're number 2 on Meetup. Well, who's number 1? Witches. But what Meetup was groups of people who were coming together in the absence of a centralized structure with lots of money and deciding what they wanted our campaign to be about. They started our campaign before we started our campaign in some informal way. And what we did was to notice what they were doing, listen to what they were doing, and coordinate what they were doing, and created a campaign out of it. The other thing we did was we understood that these people were a community, that the internet is not an ATM machine, that it is a group of people who need to be listened to. And there's a great story about a young woman who was kind of always had some tragedy going on. She was a very hardworking, loyal campaign, Nico knows who she is, worker. And she one tragedy after another. Her mother died, she got very sick. And the community just embraced her. One lady in California had a condo that she could spare for a while, and they raised food. And it was so emblematic of the fact that this was not a political campaign. It was not a transactional discussion. It was a community that decided that they had had enough of what had been going on in the country and had had enough of what had been going on in the Democratic Party for 30 years and wanted something better. And the thing I most remember is going to some place like Idaho. We actually drew a crowd in Idaho, although Barack, of course, dwarfed it 4 years later. But 1,400 people showed up at the airport in Idaho at 8 o'clock in the morning as we were passing through. And this woman came to me and said, I didn't know anybody else felt the way I feel. I thought I was all alone. And that's what the campaign was about. So what we did at the DNC has to do with what I learned in the campaign, which is one, that if you trust people at the local level, they'll always do the right thing. And the percentage of the time they get things wrong is about the same percentage that a very highly well-organized, centralized campaign gets things wrong. So trust them. They will occasionally put out statements on your behalf that you know nothing about that makes it a little difficult. But trust them, because if you let people run their own affairs, they'll work twice as hard for you in common cause than they will if you tell them what they have to do from the central office. The second thing is there are Democrats everywhere, but only half the time were we acknowledging them. Rush Limbaugh and Savage, whatever his name is, Michael Savage and Ann Coulter were the carriers of the Democratic message in 30 states, because there wasn't anybody to stand up and say, this is hogwash, we're not anything like that. And if you want to be the carrier of your own message, you have to have somebody. And the third thing had nothing to do with Democrats. If you want to govern, you have to be the president of all the people, not just the half that agrees with you. It is a sign of respect to respectfully ask people for their votes. We wanted to open a dialogue with people who hadn't voted for Democrats for years. And I don't mean so-called middle-of-the-road people who had supposedly been alienated by these horrible left-wing Democrats that the right wing used to talk about all the time. I'm talking about evangelical Christians. Evangelical Christians had no idea what Democrats were all about. They had no idea that they had more in common with us than they did with the hate mongers of the right. So we wanted to reach out. We knew evangelical Christians weren't suddenly going to come on board and vote for Democrats. But we did know that there were a lot of things that we shared in common, that if we asked them for their vote in a respectful way and asked them to sit down at the table with us so we could discuss those things that we could work together on, that they would at least believe that we weren't the demons that we were being painted as. And if you are fighting against the Republican Party, whose main strategist, Karl Rove, was quoted as saying, we poll for anger points and then we find out what they are and then we exploit them to get people to the polls, that we would remove a major weapon from the opposition, which was anger. Because it's very hard to be angry at people who are respectful of you and willing to work with you. So when I got to the DNC, that's what we did. We just learned from the campaign. We put organizers everywhere. We spoke for ourselves. We had to hire 26 press secretaries because in 26 states, there was no Democratic Party press secretary. But they had to have a press secretary because they had to have a message and to get out and to talk to people. And we put organizers everywhere. I remember the New York Times making fun of me because I went to Alaska, and some snotty 35-year-old who thought he was really smart couldn't wait to, oh, you went to Alaska. I said, yeah, it's not so dumb now that Ted Stevens is about to be convicted, was it? Now we have a senator from Alaska, right? Most important thing in politics I learned from medicine: chance favors the prepared mind, Louis Pasteur. You don't know what's going to happen in your life. You don't know what's going to happen in politics, certainly. You can't predict what's going to happen. But you can be prepared for as many eventualities as possible. Chance, of which there is a lot of in life, favors the prepared mind. You can either get blown away by something that you don't expect. Suppose Ted Stevens had been indicted, and we had no press secretary, no infrastructure, no voting list, and hadn't trained anybody that knew what they were doing in Alaska. You think we would have a Democratic senator today? I don't think so. That was it was a 6,000 vote race or something like that. It was pretty close. So chance favors the prepared mind. You got to be everywhere. If you want to be a national party, and I don't think you can count on 50% plus one, because if you miss by one, we get what we've got for the last 8 years. The second was ask everybody for their vote. We started a dialogue with evangelical Christians. And we learned that from Tim Kaine. We invested heavily in the Virginia race to learn, partly because Terry McAuliffe promised far more than we were prepared to deliver. We had to deliver it whether we liked it or not. We financed 20% of Tim Kaine's race. And in exchange for that, we got to experiment with his electorate, which is a pretty middle-of-the-road electorate of the kind that we needed to start winning and not losing. And we reached out to all kinds of people. What he did in the campaign was incredible. He went on Christian broadcast radio and says, the Bible teaches us. It didn't matter what he said after that. You had just gone into the living rooms of all these people who thought you were a demon and asked them on their own terms, would you consider voting for me? Language is everything. We don't have to use flamboyant, rhetorical, crowd-pleasing language to rally our base. We have to talk to people in language that they understand. And we began to do that in places that we hadn't done it before. So the 2006 elections were a big break for us. Obviously, we were enormously helped by George Bush. But the DCCC, which we couldn't have won without their money, but the DCCC identified, I think it was 30 races in order to get 34 races in order to win 17 seats. 5 weeks to go, they had 9 of those seats. They went out and polled and found 30 races they didn't know anything about that were staffed, not by us, but using our staff that we paid. The local people decided that these particular candidates were Tim Waltz in Minnesota, for example, was one of them. Nancy Boyda in Kansas was another. Paul Hodes in New Hampshire was another. There's 30 of them they knew nothing about. That's where the margin for 2006 came from. Now, we couldn't have won without the D-Trip because, of course, the Republicans were finding these races at the same time as we were, so somebody had to have $1 million to dump into each one of these races to fend off the attacks in the last 3 weeks. But it makes a difference to assume that you can win any place, even in the most conservative districts. This doesn't mean you put the same amount of money into Alabama as you do into Ohio with 3 weeks to go in the presidential election. But I'll tell you something about Alabama. Today, we have the first open lesbian serving in the legislature in the state of Alabama, ever. Now, I'll tell you, does that mean Alabama is suddenly going to embrace gay rights? No, but every single person who serves in the legislature in Alabama now has to see gay people as a human being and not some conjecture of some right-wing pastor who's preaching hellfire and damnation on a Sunday. That's how you get somewhere in politics, is you get people to see you as a human being, not just a group of people that you can condemn, because it's much harder to condemn someone who's right in front of you who you know as a person. And that's the difference. And that's what the real key to politics is. This is the genius of Barack Obama, which is the next thing I want to talk about. This election really is the most important election in any young person's lifetime. And unfortunately, because they're young, they may not realize it. What Obama has done is to bring in a new generation into politics, just like John F. Kennedy was for our generation. Now, John F. Kennedy was my father's age. He was not my generation. But he made it possible for this entire new ethos of hope and optimism to come to America after kind of the sleepy 50s and the difficult years around the war and so forth and so on. Barack Obama's done that for those who are under 35. And the results have been extraordinary. In 2004, young people turned out at a rate that's 20% higher than they had in 2000, and 56% of them voted for John Kerry. It was the largest number of any age group that he carried. In 2006, young people turned out at a rate 24% higher than they did in the previous off-year election, 2002, and 61% of them voted for the Democratic candidate for Congress. And in 2008, for the first time in my lifetime, more people voted who were under the age of 35 years old than voted who were over the age of 65 years old. It has always been a given that you've got to get the senior vote. Well, you've got to get the senior vote, but 35 and under vote more in this past election. And the message of Obama, there are a lot of reasons that Obama got elected, and again, he got a huge assist from George W. Bush and from the most disciplined Democratic campaign I've ever seen. But I think the main reason he got elected is the message of this new young generation, to my generation, this confrontational generation that did so many extraordinary things but was very confrontational about doing it, is, would you please stop fighting about these things that you've been fighting over for the past 30 years and start to do something about the things that we can agree on, like climate change and like poverty, that we all believe that we ought to do something about. And Obama captured that message perfectly. The message is that the campaigns of hate, anger, and division are over, and now we need to work together. This is the first multicultural generation in the history of America. It's not the first multicultural generation in terms of demographics. It's the first multicultural generation in terms of how they see themselves. They see themselves as a multicultural generation. That's never happened before in our history. And Obama is, for obvious reasons, the perfect candidate for that reason. So this is a huge generational shift in what is going on. It's a shift in tactics. It's a shift in the way we do politics. I think it's actually a shift in a worldview in the United States, which we're going to see as this young generation now has met the threshold test and is beginning to assume positions in power. First in the kind of the mid-level ranks and ultimately in cabinet positions and so forth, just as our generation did because of John F. Kennedy coming in. It's a milestone election. It's not, much has been made of Obama being the first African-American president, and that's incredibly important, given the history of race in this country, and it's incredibly important to people all over the world who realize that America is now willing to do things that are out of the box again, which is what they've always hoped that we would continue to do. But the most important thing Obama's election means to us, I think, is not just that, is that this is a new paradigm shift in who runs America. It is the people who, instead of gathering 1 million people on the Mall in Washington, send 1 million emails to Congress and cause denial of service shutdown for 3 days. That influences Congress. It is the people with the new ethical ethos, which has a huge service component. I don't know many people who are young who haven't served in doing something, whether it's AmeriCorps or going to Honduras to teach school on their own, or going to build houses in New Orleans, whatever it is. There are enormous numbers of young people. Our generation was an incredibly adventurous generation, did all kinds of interesting things. But these folks are about serving other people because they understand there's a connection between their own education and being better people and serving better people and doing better and that kind of service. So it is a huge generational shift, I would maintain, that's going on in this election. And I don't think that Barack Obama, in some ways, led the shift. Because I don't believe in the great man theory of history. It's why I sort of reject the idea that the Dean campaign revolutionized campaign. Revolutions don't happen from the top down. They happen from the bottom up. In our campaign, I kind of outlined for you how I saw what happened. I do think our campaign revolutionized democratic politics, and maybe politics in general. But we weren't the people that were doing the revolutionizing. The revolutionizing was there, and there was a tidal wave of people who wanted to do things differently, who had an extraordinary tool, the most extraordinary tool since Gutenberg invented the printing press more than 500 years ago, in order to empower themselves to make a difference again in an increasingly corporatized world. But now, this whole new generation has begun to empower themselves in ways, not because of Obama, but because they had someone in the leadership position, which was Obama, who was able to reflect back to them what their beliefs were, their extraordinary energies and their extraordinary and his extraordinary ability to articulate that extraordinary tidal wave of change that was coming from people who were under 35 in this country. So it's an interesting mix of people because you're older than the average audience that I usually talk to, which is college students about this. But it's kind of a fun mix for me. My father once told me when I was about 20, which of course I had no interest in listening to because I was about 20, that he had an advantage over me because he could look backwards as well as forwards, and I could only look forwards. And it's really true. It's starkly true in the idea that I, in the 60s, was very sympathetic to civil rights and involved in some of that sort of stuff. And here we are with an African-American president, something I or my African-American roommates from the 60s never thought we would live to see. So I look backwards, and it seems like a short time. And young people look forwards, and it seems like forever. But looking backwards, this election is a real watershed election. And the only other one I've seen that was anything like it was the election of John F. Kennedy, who similarly captured the energy and the imagination and the sort of the forward-looking spirit of America in his extraordinary campaign in 1960, as I think Barack Obama has done. So he is this election is, and he is, a historical figure, not for anything he will or will not do, although we hope for much from him, but because of what he's already accomplished. And it's not so much he that accomplished it, it is this extraordinary young generation of Americans who has transformed the world by electing Barack as their statement for what they see the direction of the new America is. So thanks very much, and in the Harvard tradition, I'll be happy to take comments, questions, and rude remarks as necessary.
If you want to pass the water, there's some water underneath there.
That's great, thank you. Thank you.
I'll just set it up for you very quickly. And as the tradition directs, if you would please identify yourselves. There are 4 microphones, 2 on the floor and 1 each up above. Identify yourself, ask a question. You know how to do that, but it has a question mark at the end, and of course you'll know that it's just one question that you'll ask, and we'll start right down here.
Yes, my name is Rich Prager, retiree from Dun & Bradstreet, and to loosen you up a little bit, I was wondering if I may call you Howard.
You may do me anything you like. I've been called far worse.
Okay. A couple of years ago, we had a guest, just like yourself, and the person that spoke to him was Ronald Reagan when he was traveling overseas. And he said to him, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Today, we have a different kind of a wall. It's called the money wall." And for the people out there that don't know, the Stock of Tears, IH, the initials, closed at 90 cents a share. So my statement to you would be, if you could go back to Washington or the people from AIG, we have in spirit a person that said a long time ago, and you can tell them that the buck stops here, and that was from Harry Truman.
Your question is?
It's not a question, it's a statement.
Well, actually, I will just comment on this briefly. I was asked at lunch why this is a big deal, why these $165 million worth of bonuses are a big deal. It's such a small percentage of the total amount of money in the stimulus package. The American people can't get their arms around $678 billion worth of stimulus, but they can get their arms around the idea of people who have grossly failed in their fiduciary duty, not just to their shareholders, but to Americans in general, collecting a ton of money that's our money. That's what the issue is here. The issue is that this is a character issue. This is not a money issue. And it'll be written about that, $165 million could pay for this or pay for that. This is about the fundamental character of the leadership of America. And that's why this is a big deal, and that's why you see everybody scrambling in Washington to fix this. And they should fix it, because it's an outrage. It is the wrong thing to do. It was a political misjudgment. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of what really mattered to people. And money matters a lot to people, but character matters more. And so I think your point's well taken.
Hi, I'm Dr. Dean. It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm a Master's of Public Policy student, second year. I live in New Orleans. The question I'd like to ask you is, considering how healthcare has been such an important issue for you, why have you not been appointed, Health and Human Secretary? Because you're such a qualified, you're such a qualified applicant.
Well, I don't make those appointments, so anything I would say would be speculation, which we shouldn't engage in. There's actually a really interesting, look, there's a lot of speculation. Without saying any more than I'm just going to say, and I'm not going to elaborate on this, the most interesting thing would have to be extrapolated from a very interesting article that I saw this morning for the first time, or maybe it was yesterday, by Jonathan Cohn in the New Republic. If you read that article, you may have some insight. It doesn't discuss whether I got appointed or anything like that, but when you read that article, you may understand.
Yes. Hi. I'm Christian News. I've heard a lot about you. As a matter of fact, my aunt, one of my aunts worked in your campaign in 2004. Tell me, what if John Kerry had not run for the Democratic nomination for president? Would you have won the nomination? Would you have won the nomination, and would you have been able to beat Bush?
Well,
seat Bush.
Look, let me deal with the first question. Whether I won the nomination or not may or may not have had anything to do with John Kerry. The reason I didn't win the nomination in principle was because in September when I was leading, I knew that I could not continue to be the candidate of insurrection and insurgency, because people love an insurrectionist and an insurgent, but not for president. So we had a big debate inside the campaign, and I took some advice that, in retrospect, I shouldn't have taken, but I'm the person who was responsible for that, because I had the choice that I needed not to change the content of what I was saying, but I very much needed to change the way I was saying it in. And the fear was at the time that we would lose our base of people who were really determined to, and angry about what was going on. But as it turned out, if you want to be president, you've got to go beyond your base of people who are determined to change everything, and you've got to reach out to broad numbers of people who are concerned but want to make sure that you're qualified to be president. And I think that in September I needed to make that shift, and I didn't make it. And there was a lot of other things that went on that didn't go right in the campaign and all that kind of stuff. But that's the reason I think I didn't win the nomination. Whether I could have beat Bush or not is anybody's conjecture. They certainly were well organized and had lots of money, but I don't think we'll ever know that answer to that question. But thank you for asking.
Adam Chepnick, I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm a Democrat, but I'm also getting a little nervous about the amount of money that the government is spending and throwing at trying to fix the crises that we're in right now. One of the classes that I was in, they talked about how FDR didn't actually help the economy recover until we entered the war effort. So I'm interested to know your perception as to whether you think the current stimulus package and all the efforts being undertaken will actually work, or if it's not going to be a successful effort.
I think yesterday's action by Bernanke is the most important thing that's been done so far. I do think the stimulus package is a good thing, but in my view, until the toxic assets are off the bank's balance sheets, we're not going to see recovery. We're in an industrial recession of the kind that happens from time to time for a variety of reasons, which I don't think we need to go into here. But we're also layered on top of that as a major financial panic induced by grossly irresponsible and outrageous behavior on the part of our financial leadership in this country, and partly on the part of the previous administration. Whatever the merits of that are, and who should pay for it and who should go to jail and all that kind of stuff is, you cannot have a banking system that's paralyzed and get recovery. The only way that you can fix this is to get the assets that cannot be sold and are unmarketable off the bank's balance sheets. Now, in my own view, there is no harm in having the government take those assets, which is what Bernanke began the process of yesterday. Because these assets have already been written down substantially, and I very much hope that we're not buying them at par, because that would be a gross injustice to the American taxpayer. But there is a price at which you can buy these assets and they'll make money. And there are hedge funds that are now buying these assets. They just don't happen to have the several $1 trillion that you need to get them all off the sheets. Well, the problem is time. The reason these assets are unmarketable is not that they're worthless. It's that nobody wants to put in the 25 years it's going to take to unwind them fully and with minimal risk. So the government has time. We could do this. And we are doing it, and the Federal Reserve is doing it, and I think they're doing exactly what has to happen to get us out of this. I'm optimistic. I think this is probably grossly irresponsible of me to say this, but I think there's going to be one more test of the lows on Wall Street, and whether they pierce them or not, I don't know. But I think we're pretty close to the bottom in the markets, and I think the economy will be a distant follower. I mean, the markets are always the predictor, not the follower. But it seems to me that if this continues, and if we continue to take these toxic assets off the bank's balance sheets, that's exactly what has to happen. If it doesn't happen, we're not going to get out of this. I don't care how much of a stimulus you put in. The key here is the Federal Reserve, not the Congress and the President, in my view.
Hi, I'm Sam Sanders, a student here at the Kennedy School, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on Dem Party unity in, light of Senator Bayh's formation of a Gang of 15, moderates in the Senate recently.
Are you talking about the Gang of 15 that has to do with health insurance reform?
Yeah, yeah.
Pardon? Oh, well, look, they can establish what they establish. People still have to vote their constituencies. Look, let me just, because there's a lot of talk about what's going to pass in healthcare. Let me just be very blunt. If Americans' choice of what healthcare plan they can select does not include a public option, then there should not be healthcare reform, because it'll be a complete and total waste of money. Period. We need to have because Americans deserve, with all the money we're going to put into this, we deserve to be able to choose the best plan. And the best plan ought to include the possibility of choosing Medicare. And if it doesn't include it, we shouldn't waste all the money that people are talking about on any kind of health care reform, because it won't be. We'll simply be propping up a system that does not work. So I don't care if you're a moderate or conservative or what you are, that's the criteria for health insurance. If you want to fool around with some bill that doesn't leave a public option, don't waste your time. Look what the private sector's already done to healthcare in the last 30 years. Their costs have gone up at 3 times the rate of inflation. There isn't a reasonable person in America who knows anything about healthcare who could make the case that the private sector is more efficient than the public sector in healthcare. There's not. And I don't think that we ought to have a Canadian-style or a British-style single payer in America. I think we ought to give the American people the choice. And I think if you do give them the choice, they're going to make their own views clear at the pace that they choose to be clear. But a system of healthcare reform without a public option is not healthcare reform. So, if that's what your question was aiming at, that wasn't what your question was aiming at. Okay, well, I'm glad you got me to make a controversial point, even though that wasn't an aim. Should we give him a second choice? All right.
I just want just party unity. Seeing some Democrats begin to kind of.
Well, look, I mean, party unity is great, but people should. I think there's room for debate in the party. Evan Bayh's a good friend, and if he wants to say something different to me, I have no problem with that at all. But if the purpose of forming a coalition of moderates is to put together some kind of private sector healthcare that's once again indebted to the insurance industry, I think that's a huge mistake, and I'm off the boat.
Yeah. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Andy Sisson. I live in the area. A question about converting the organization that Obama's campaign put together into sort of a long-term support for Democrat. What should your successors, I guess, at the DNC be doing to do this, make this happen, and for that matter, the state and local parties?
Well, as far as the DNC, I think they're doing just exactly what I hoped they were doing. They have incorporated the campaign into what they call Organizing for America, which is a support group for the initiatives of the president, which I think is a very appropriate use of the DNC. I'm delighted they did it. There was some talk they were going to do it outside the DNC, and they didn't. That's exactly what a political party should be doing. I mean, one of the things I found when I got to the DNC is that they only organized every fourth year for the president, and you can't do that. I mean, you've got to be in one of the reasons the Republicans frankly kicked our rear end for 30 years is because they were organizing every moment of the day, whether they were in power or out of the power, and you've got to do that. And I see these guys as organizing very, very well through the DNC, and I'm frankly delighted that they have that, and it's based in the DNC and it's policy-oriented. And there will undoubtedly be some Democrats who have a different position on some of the policies, and I may be one of them at some point, but I still think you need that you need to always use your political organization or it atrophies, and I think it's a very positive thing.
Hi, Governor Dean. My name is Kostas Bousios, and I'm a research scientist recently laid off. And I have a question. The Democrats in Congress in the fall, why would they have allowed themselves to be rushed into voting the TARP without demanding any safeguards as to how the money would or would not be spent?
Well, I can tell you why that kind of thing happens is because people in Washington often respond as quickly as possible so as to cover a large part of their anatomy that they often sit on, and they want to get it done so fast so nobody can criticize them, and the result is often legislation that's not very good. It's how we got in Iraq.
Hi, Dr. Dean. I'm Nemat Sadat. I'm originally from Afghanistan. I'm a journalism graduate student here. My question for you is I really appreciate you talking about the multicultural coalition that was built. My only concern is, and with your experience as DNC chairman, I want to see if you can address this. The grass movement in your campaign, also Barack Obama's campaign, was a far left anti-war movement that first started, then it eventually reached the entire nation. But my concern is, Barack Obama is taking a conciliatory approach towards the Republicans by, but they haven't been embracing that. For example, they haven't, on the recent stimulus bill, not one Republican in Congress voted in favor of that. So my question for you is, do you think that there's a possible threat of not being able to bring Republicans over to the Democratic Party to vote on certain issues, but at the same time, risking the alienation of people on the far left in upcoming elections?
Well, first let me say I don't think there is such a thing as the far left in America. Far left, there was a far left in the 70s. I don't see any evidence of anything like that now. I mean, what you might consider the far left, we at those days would have considered to be relatively moderate. Uh, just to set the record straight in a historical perspective. Look, the president has a difficult job because the president has to be president of all the American people, not just the people who voted for him. In general, I have to say that I've been pretty satisfied. There have been some rhetorical things that have been said that have given me some concern, but then when you look at the action, you find that the president is not doing the one thing that he really can't do in order to be a good president. I have not yet seen him in any major way give up on any of his core principles. I think it's respectful to talk to people in their own language. And look, the president is not just reaching out to Republicans in Congress, he's reaching out to Republicans all over the country. And as we saw in the last election, Republicans all over the country are not in the same place as the Republican leadership or the Republicans in Congress. So I think the president is right to continue to reach out to Republicans, and I think the Republicans are self-destructing by not supporting some of his programs. I understand why there are certain things they might not support, but there is no excuse for them supporting things that are good for America. And they themselves are having this ongoing debate, which they're far from settling, is shall they be the party of no? And if they choose to be the party of no, I think that's what the electorate, including a lot of Republicans, are going to say to them in 2010 and 2012. So I understand your concern. And as somebody certainly on the center-left end of the edge of the spectrum rather than the center-right, I concur with your vigilance, but I also think the president is doing exactly what he was asked to do by the electorate. He was asked to be the president of healing, and it's kind of, again, people from my generation who are used to storming the ramparts over issues of principle may be a little uncomfortable with it, but I think it's the right thing for this generation, it's the right thing for this time, it's the right thing for the world. And I think people in my age are just going to have to put up with it and understand what he's doing and why he's doing it. And in general, I think we should give him the benefit of the doubt at every opportunity because he's doing what he was hired to do by this group of young people who are trying to heal the country.
Thank you. Right up here.
Hi, Governor Dean. My name is David Baumwalt. I am a first-year Master's in Public Policy student here at the Kennedy School. And you've accomplished a great deal in your career as a doctor, with the DNC in the 2004 election, and I'm just wondering, when it's all said and done, what would you like your legacy to be?
Well, I don't care what my legacy is. As Tina said, all I want to do is get health insurance for everybody. And if we do that, legacies are written by other people. If we do that, I'll be satisfied, and that's what matters to me.
Thank you.
I mean, there's a few other laundry lists, like, make a gazillion dollars in the stock market, and,
While we're up there, go on.
Hi, my name is Mimi. I'm from the Kennedy School, and as you know, the Bush administration and the government under the Bush administration tortured. And the current administration has said that they will not torture, but they also have indicated that they will not prosecute. As a doctor and one who's sworn to do no harm, how do you feel about that? Do you think that the Obama administration should prosecute or should at least bring to full light all of the practices that took, that under the Bush administration?
I think the second question is a no-brainer. You have to have everything come to full light. Everything has to come to full light. The prosecution problem is a much more difficult problem. The president was elected partly because people wanted to end 30 years of anger-based politics. And so to engage in what might be perceived as a witch hunt by some, or politically motivated by some, would endanger that incredibly important mission, I think. My own home state senator has proposed something which was used in South Africa, which is basically a truth and reconciliation process. The way I'd answer that is this. On the question of the truth, there's no argument about that. There's no excuse for not knowing what the truth was, and we should know, period. On the question of what you do about it, you have a conflict between the desire to heal the country after certainly 8 disastrous years, but really I would argue pretty disastrous years going back to 1968 with the Southern strategy, which are where I think this all started, Richard Nixon, and to heal the country, and also to uphold the rule of law. And I think you have to find a balance somehow. And the balance that I would find is either to have some kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission after the truth gets known, so you can know that if there are prosecutable grounds or not, which of course we suspect there are, but we don't know that for a fact yet, or to have a special prosecutor and allow that prosecutor the full range of whatever a reasonable, thoughtful prosecutor would do, independent of the government. Because I don't see how the Justice Department can prosecute without creating the fear among a significant part of the population that this is politically motivated. So if there's going to be a prosecution, I think first we need to find out what the evidence is in all of it, and it needs to be public so every American can make their own judgment. And then second, the decision would be to whether to appoint a special prosecutor or not, independent of the government, in order to make sure that the rule of law continues to be upheld.
Yeah, but if you do talk about what happens and then you don't prosecute, doesn't that send a message of impunity? I mean, aren't you suggesting that people have broken the law, but there's no consequence?
Well, that's the difficult balance. You have to find the very delicate balance between upholding the rule of law, which means justice under the law, not just exposure, against the concern of polarizing the country at a very difficult, delicate time after 40 years of very ugly polarization, which hasn't served us well. That's the balance you have to strike. And so there'll be a lot of discussion and debate about that. But first, I think the truth should be known without fear or favor of what the result may be.
Thank you.
Hi, Governor Dean, Martin Solomon. I worked with you on the campaign. Nice to see you again.
Welcome back, Doctor.
I'm a primary care physician, and I've been very concerned about national health insurance and universal health care. But the health care problem in this country is very complex, and as you know, simply providing universal access isn't going to fix our problem. The truth of the matter is that the administration's plan to address the health care crisis by applying electronic medical records and chronic disease management and somehow paying for more and more people to get health care will in fact bring us up, we hope, from 37th in the world in the quality of the care that we deliver, but it will dramatically raise the cost of health care in this country. And as health care becomes more and more of a problem in our budget, how do you propose to resolve these two issues? Thank you.
Well, I think that you've got to do the universal access, because I think it's impossible outside a rationalized system where everybody's in the system. It's almost impossible to do any kind of serious cost control or real sensible treatment, even from a demographic public health point of view, overall point of view. Look, the easy part is about what we're engaged in now, is getting everybody in the system, and that's going to be incredibly hard, but that's the easy part. The hard part is changing not just the political psyche, but the American psyche, so that we can focus, instead of on an illness model of healthcare, on a wellness model of healthcare. Right now, everything we do, and including, most importantly, the way we're paid, has to do with what happens when you get sick, and then we get paid for doing things that make you unsick. Wouldn't it be much better if we got paid for making sure you didn't get sick in the first place? However, that's not just a matter of doctors, hospitals, and the medical industrial establishment. That goes to a fundamental cultural change in the way Americans think about it themselves. And that is going to be a lot harder to change. Although there are some interesting signs. I was in a school, and I wish I could remember where this was, where I was in Massachusetts, in western Massachusetts, where they had just removed all the trashy food and vending machines, and I expected there to be a huge student uproar. In fact, the students were very supportive of it. So maybe among the other things that this new generation is going to do is actually understand that there are personal and societal consequences for their individual choices that they make that run up healthcare bills, and they don't really have a right to do anything they want to themselves, because we all end up paying for that as a shared response. Now, that is a very difficult concept. It's the motorcycle helmet argument, and you can see the pattern of laws in states that have motorcycle helmets and that don't. And the argument that I always thought the best argument for motorcycle helmets was not, we have a right to tell you what to do, because of course that puts hackles on every American's back, is that we have a right not to pay for your bad decision making, and therefore it's going to be against the law to make that kind of a decision, as it would be to drive drunk. But that's a huge cultural shift. That is the ultimate barrier, I think, to the serious cost. There'll be cost controls that we can put in, but they will not even approach what we could do if we were able to change the entire psyche of the American culture to think about wellness instead of illness.
We have time for 2 more questions, and we'll have a question here and a question there. You first.
Governor, good evening, and thank you so much for coming. My name is Blake Bainu from the 23rd District of California. And my question for
And so who's your congressman?
Lois Capps.
Who?
Lois
Oh,
Capps.
Lois Capps.
Yes.
Very good.
My question for you this evening is, how important do you think the Hispanic vote will be in the next century for American politics?
Oh, that's a great question. That's known as the softball right down the middle of the plate. It's incredibly muy importante. Look, this is the fastest demographic group growing democratic group in America. It's also the most underorganized demographic group in America. Very interestingly so, possibly with the exception of American Indians. So there's enormous potential here, enormous potential. Hispanics are still incredibly underrepresented in the percentage of their vote relative to other ethnic groups. And it's simply a matter of organization and registration and so forth and so on. And this is going to be an incredibly important group for us. And it's a group the Republicans have done everything in their power to make sure they vote Democrat. It's just extraordinary to see what they've. I mean, it's just you start demonizing immigrants, and suddenly they become all Hispanics are being demonized. It's the damnedest thing I ever saw. I just couldn't believe they were doing this stuff. The nature of the debates on the floor of Congress. You don't think Hispanic people noticed what John Cornyn was saying about? It's just unbelievable. I had dinner with a group of Cuban Americans, older Cuban Americans, about 2 years ago. Obviously, asking for money for the Democratic Party. And these guys, this is the most Republican ethnic group in America is Cuban Americans over the age of 60. I mean, I got to believe that's 99.9%, more than evangelical Christians, right? They were so angry at the Republicans. Why were they so angry? These guys have the best immigration deal of anybody in the world. You set 1 foot on dry soil in America and you're a citizen. Bang, that's how it goes. I mean, you're in. Nobody has a deal like that. Why are they angry? Because on the floor, in the halls of Congress, the Republicans are pushing this fence that's aimed against people whose name happens to end in EZ or a vowel, just like theirs, and they feel like they're being treated like animals. Now, these are successful Cuban-American businessmen who are worth millions of dollars, and they were outraged. How the Republicans could not have figured out that a debate that's aimed against immigrants, the vast majority of whom happen to be from Hispanic or Spanish-speaking countries, is not going to have some spillover to the millions and millions of people who are Hispanic. I do not know the answer to that, but I suspect that if we do the things that we ought to be doing to appeal to hardworking middle-class people, which of course includes Hispanics, over the next 25 years, we will be able to enjoy the same kind of majority, which was a very big majority that we had this time.
Hi, I'm Bijan Tavasoli, and I would like to know how you want to ensure that no taxpayers' money is transferred to stockholders when you buy so-called toxic assets at higher than market prices.
I don't think we should buy, well, there are no market prices. I mean, look, there aren't. I mean, nobody knows what they're worth.
Well, you have private companies, private investors who would be willing to pay a certain price.
There are, in some cases.
That is called a market.
Yeah, that is. But the problem is there's trillions and trillions of dollars worth of these things, and a few $100 million have changed hands. So, I mean, look, the price that's going to be, in my view, which I would certainly be willing to listen to other people who know more about this than I do. In my view, ultimately, in order to take the toxic assets off the balance sheets, we're going to arrive at a political price, not an economic price. The political price is going to be simply enough of a haircut for the banks so that the taxpayers are not likely to take a hit, and not so much of a haircut so the banks are driven into bankruptcy. This is not a bailout for the banks. This is a resetting of the banking system with banking. We ought to be able to do this and make money. That would be my goal if I were the president or the secretary of the Treasury. We ought to be able to find a price at which we have a reasonable possibility of holding these assets for long term, a couple of decades, and making money, and yet a price that is not so damaging to the banks that they all go bankrupt. And I think that number exists someplace. There are some transactions that have taken place, as you pointed out, but they are pretty small relative to the size of the problem. So this is not meant as a bail. I have no interest in bailing out the bondholders or the shareholders or anybody else. That's not the point. What I do want to make sure is that the banks function again. And I don't believe in America the best solution is nationalization. The reason I don't believe that is the American government has no experience in running banks. In Europe, you might want to use nationalization because there's a lot of historically experience in European countries with running banks as a nationalized institution. That experience does not exist here for the most part. We do it in very short-term increments. The FDIC takes over a bank and then closes it and fixes it and sells it in a week and so forth. That doesn't really, we're talking about ongoing management of a financial institution. As is evidenced by AIG, we certainly have very little expertise in that. So that's why I said what I said about the banking. You're right to be concerned about the taxpayers, because that's the bottom line. I think you can do this without the taxpayers taking much of a hit. In fact, I think you can actually probably make money. But I also think you've got to be careful to find the right balance, and it probably is not going to be an economic equation because there's not enough. If there were a market in this stuff, most of it would be sold, and there isn't.
Join me in thanking Governor Dean.
Thank you. Thank you. It's fun. It's usually a very small audience, which is always a little nerve-wracking.